Welcome to the deep dive, everyone. Today we're going to be taking a look at when to rob a bank,
Oh, nice.
which is it's kind of a collection of blog posts from the Freakonomics guys.
Okay,
So that's Stephen D. Levitt and Stephen J. Dubner,
cool.
and it's full of their trademark kind of economics and quirky topics.
Yeah, they definitely have a knack for finding those interesting little nuggets
Yeah.
that you wouldn't normally think have an economic angle.
Right, right. So are you ready to kind of get those brain cells firing?
Absolutely. Always up for a good mental workout. Let's do it.
Okay. Well, right off the bat, they jump into terrorism.
Oh, wow. Starting off strong.
Yeah, which isn't exactly light reading.
No, no kidding.
But Levitt, he shares this kind of disturbingly simple idea for a terrorist attack. It was actually dreamt up by his own father.
Really?
Imagine like 20 people with rifles and cars, and they're all spread out across the country, and they all just start shooting randomly at the same time.
Oh, well.
And it's crazy how easy it would be to just cause widespread chaos.
Yeah, that sends chills down my spine just thinking about it. But it does highlight a point that they make, which is like a cost-benefit analysis.
Right.
And Levitt actually argues that adapting to like low-grade terrorism, the kind that we see in other parts of the world, might actually be more economically sound.
Hmm. So instead of letting fear drive massive spending on security measures and restrictions on freedom, maybe we should be looking at the bigger picture.
Yeah, that's his argument. Think about it, like living in a country that has really high inflation all the time.
Okay.
Eventually, people just adapt their behavior.
Yeah.
The economy finds a new equilibrium. And so he's suggesting that if we could adapt to, a certain level of low-grade terrorism, it might actually be more cost-effective than the constant state of fear we live in.
But wouldn't that mean accepting like a certain level of risk? And how do you even balance that with, keeping people safe?
It's a tricky question, right? And there's no easy answers. But Levitt suggests focusing resources on things like stricter screening of potential risks entering the country.
Okay.
Particularly those on visas, and then maybe enhanced surveillance once they're here. So it's less about like trying to control everything and more about really targeting the effort.
Okay. Yeah. Makes sense. Shifting gears a bit, let's talk about taxes.
Oh, everyone's favorite subject.
Right. The book, it dives into those inefficiencies of how taxes are collected here in the U.S., specifically how the IRS relies on these third-party contractors who get a cut of whatever they recover.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that. So they're basically incentivized to find more people who owe taxes.
Right, right. And the authors highlight the irony of this whole situation. They say that hiring more IRS agents would actually be way more cost-effective.
Interesting. So why not just hire more agents then?
Well, that's the million-dollar question. Politicians are, well, understandably, hesitant to advocate for increased IRS funding. It's, not exactly a vote winner. Who wants to be seen as pro-tax man, right?
Right. No one's going to put that on a campaign poster.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the authors, they propose a bold reframing. They say, let's relaunch the effort as a war on tax cheats.
War on tax cheats. I see where they're going with that, kind of playing on that whole wartime mentality.
Yeah, it's like how war on terror or war on drugs, those have been used to get public support for increased funding and policy changes.
Yeah, using those powerful terms to really galvanize the public, but wouldn't that just create even more fear and division?
Potentially, but their thinking is that framing tax evasion as like a threat to national security or economic stability could shift public perception.
Okay, interesting. So make it less about punishing individuals and more about protecting the greater good.
Right. Let's move on to something a little less contentious. How about public libraries?
Libraries, yes. I love a good library.
There's this ongoing debate about whether they actually hurt book sales.
Really?
Yeah, some people argue that if people can borrow books for free, they're less likely to buy them.
I can see that argument.
Right. But Levitt and Dubner, they actually counter that argument.
Oh, okay.
They say that libraries actually boost book sales.
Oh, how so?
Well, they say that libraries, they kind of foster a reading culture, and they introduce people, readers, to authors that they might not have discovered otherwise.
Yeah, it's like a gateway to a whole world of reading.
Exactly. I mean, think about all the times you borrowed a book from the library and then loved it so much that you ended up buying your own copy.
Oh, yeah. Definitely been there.
Right.
Yeah.
So libraries are kind of acting like this discovery platform.
That makes a lot of sense.
Nurturing a love for reading and driving those sales in the long run. Okay, get ready for this next one. We're going to talk about tenure.
Uh-oh. Tenure, that's a hot topic, especially in academia.
Right. And Levitt, he throws out this pretty radical idea, abolishing tenure altogether.
Wow, he doesn't hold back, does he? Tenure is like a cornerstone of academic freedom, isn't it?
Yeah, and job security.
Right, right. So what's his reasoning behind abolishing it?
Well, the argument for tenure is that it encourages intellectual exploration and it protects professors from being fired for expressing unpopular views.
Right, right.
But Levitt, he says that the current system where, there's a lot less incentive after you've already gotten tenure might actually lead to decreased productivity and complacency.
So it's almost like the opposite of what it's intended to do.
Yeah, that's his point.
Mm.
Instead of fostering this innovation, it creates this system where some professors, they're just coasting along. They're not really contributing as much as they could be.
Interesting. So what does he suggest instead?
He proposes this more performance-driven model, kind of like what we see in other industries.
Okay.
Where, your job depends on your output, the impact you're having, your contribution to the field.
So more accountability, I guess.
Exactly. It's all about aligning incentives with the desired outcomes.
Right, right.
Okay, this next topic takes us to the UK. The authors propose a pretty bold reform for their healthcare system.
Right.
Giving every citizen an annual healthcare allowance.
Okay. How much are we talking here?
They suggest £1,000.
Okay. And this would go directly to individuals.
Yeah. To spend on healthcare however they see fit. And if they don't use it all, they get to keep the remainder.
Interesting. So it's kind of like introducing this element of consumer choice into their system.
Exactly. They're trying to encourage people to be more cost-conscious about their healthcare decisions.
That's a pretty radical departure from a socialized healthcare system. What are some of the potential benefits they see?
Well, proponents argue that it could lead to significant cost savings. Individuals, they're more likely to shop around for the best prices and avoid unnecessary treatments.
Okay.
It also shifts the focus to individual responsibility and empowers people to make their own decisions about their healthcare spending.
Okay, yeah, I can see that. But what about people with chronic illnesses?
Yeah.
Or unexpected medical expenses? Wouldn't they run out of their allowance pretty quickly?
That's a valid concern. And the authors, they do acknowledge that this system wouldn't be perfect for everyone, especially those with, pre-existing conditions or high healthcare needs.
Yeah.
But they argue that the potential cost savings and this increased consumer choice might outweigh those drawbacks.
So it's like a trade-off, as with most things in life.
Right. It's about finding a balance,
Yeah.
Between individual responsibility and making sure everyone have access to the care that they need. Now, let's dive into a topic that might make some people a little uncomfortable. Rethinking voting systems.
Oh, this sounds intriguing.
Yeah. So economist Glenn Weil, he proposes an alternative where everyone gets multiple votes. But there's a catch.
Oh, there's always a catch.
Each vote costs money.
I knew it.
And the price goes up exponentially with each additional vote you cast.
So it's kind of like a progressive tax on voting.
Exactly. To put your money where your mouth is, right?
Yeah.
The idea is to give more weight to informed votes and discourage uninformed or impulsive voting.
Okay, so someone who's really passionate about an issue, who's done their research, they would be more willing to pay more for those extra votes.
Right. While someone who's, less informed, they might just cast that single, cheaper vote.
Interesting concept, but wouldn't that just inherently favor wealthier individuals? They could just buy more votes.
It's a valid point.
Yeah.
And while he does acknowledge this potential issue, and he suggests ways to mitigate it, like maybe setting a cap on the total amount that someone can spend.
Okay, so there would be some limits in place.
Yeah. It's definitely a fascinating concept, though, and it raises some interesting questions about how we value and how we incentivize informed participation in democracy.
Definitely food for thought.
Okay, you ready for this one? The authors suggest incentivizing politicians with massive cash payouts based on the positive societal impact of their work.
Wow, now that's a radical idea.
Yeah. So think of it like stock options in the business world. Executives get rewarded if their company does well.
Great.
Levitt's suggesting, applying that to politics, instead of just having a fixed salary, politicians would receive these performance-based bonuses.
Okay, so like a commission on good governance.
Exactly. Imagine a world where, like the U.S. Secretary of Education, he gets a multi-million-dollar bonus if test scores significantly improve.
Wow, talk about motivation, right? But
Yeah.
but how would you even measure something like that? It seems pretty subjective.
That's the challenge, right?
Hmm.
How do you measure the actual societal impact of a politician's work?
Right, like what policies led to specific outcomes? How do you isolate the contributions of individual politicians?
Exactly. It's a huge tangled web. Okay, let's lighten things up with a quirky little anecdote from the book. Apparently, Levitt banned his daughters from dating anyone with the middle name Wayne.
What? Why?
He observed that a surprising number of criminals seem to have the middle name Wayne. He even jokes that he probably should have done a regression analysis first, before implementing this dating ban.
Oh, that's hilarious. But it does raise an interesting question about whether names, especially those with certain cultural associations, can actually influence our perceptions and behavior.
Right. Like it's not about Wayne specifically. It's more about what that name might represent or evoke, like a subconscious link to certain stereotypes.
Yeah, yeah. Our brains are constantly making these associations. And names, even middle names, can act as these subtle triggers.
Yeah, it's like how certain names, like for example, Florence, might be associated with nursing, thanks to Florence Nightingale.
Right, right. And even those subconscious associations, they can influence our interactions and decisions. It's wild to die about.
It's a reminder that even those seemingly insignificant factors can play a role in shaping our perceptions and judgments.
Definitely. Now, speaking of names, they also talk about aptonyms in the book.
Aptonyms.
Yeah, those names that seem to perfectly match someone's profession or personality.
Oh, right, right. Like they share a story about Pageworthy, right?
Yes.
The fact checker. It's like her name perfectly embodies her job.
It's almost too perfect.
I know, it's amazing. But it does highlight the fact that there is a historical connection between names and professions.
Yeah.
Back in the day, a lot of last names were occupational, like Smith, Baker, Cooper, stuff like that.
Right. So those names weren't random choices. They were markers of identity and livelihood.
Exactly. So aptonyms are kind of like these little linguistic fossils. They're reminding us of a time when names actually carried more weight and meaning.
That's a cool way to think about it, even though today names are often chosen for completely different reasons.
Right, right. Let's delve into a darker side of human behavior, the economics of hate mail.
Oh, wow.
Okay. So Dubner, he got this piece of hate mail from a rather peculiar website. It's called www.whotahate.com.
Wait, seriously, a website called Who to Hate?
Yeah. And get this, for just $5, you can send an anonymous hate message to anyone you want.
Wow. It's disturbing that someone would actually pay to send hate mail.
Right. Like what's the motivation behind that?
Yeah. Is it just to vent, to get those feelings out, or is there something deeper going on?
Right. Is that the act of expressing the hate itself that's satisfying, or is it more about trying to inflict pain on the recipient?
I mean, the anonymity of the internet definitely makes people bolder.
Definitely. And Dubner, he even suggests that the website could, amp up the emotional impact with a premium service, where for a larger sum, they'd actually reveal the sender's identity.
Wow. That's taking hate mail to a whole new level.
Right. And it raises questions about the ethical implications of anonymity online, how that can be used for harmful purposes. Let's move on to something a little bit more practical, generic drug pricing.
Okay. Yeah, that's something that affects a lot of people.
Right. Dubner shares this experience he had of finding these big price differences for generic Prozac at different pharmacies.
Oh, really?
He discovered that warehouse clubs like Costco and Sam's Club, they had significantly lower prices compared to the traditional drugstore chains.
That's interesting. So, same exact medication, but the price was completely different.
Yeah, dramatically different depending on where he shopped.
Why do you think there's such a huge discrepancy?
Well, it highlights this point, the importance of being an informed consumer,
Yeah.
by comparing prices and considering those alternative options, like going to those warehouse clubs. You can actually save a lot of money,
Right.
especially on something as essential as your medications.
It really pays to do your research.
It does. Okay, how about the car buying process? Anyone enjoy that? I'm guessing not.
Not really. It's always a bit of a headache.
Yeah, Dubner recounts his own experience of trying to negotiate a lower car price online.
Okay.
And he ended up walking away from the deal.
What happened?
Well, the dealer, he just wouldn't budge. He kept using these tactics.
Oh, so it's a classic case of dealer games.
Yeah. And it just goes to show how complex those car buying negotiations can be.
It's like a battle of wills, isn't it?
It is. The dealer's trying to maximize their profit, and the
Mhm.
buyer's trying to get the best possible price. And sometimes walking away is the best strategy.
Yeah. You got to know your limits.
Exactly. Okay, let's move on to a topic that's been debated for ages. The penny.
The penny.
Yeah. Should we keep it, or is it time to get rid of it? It costs more to produce than it's actually worth.
And let's be honest, who actually uses pennies anymore?
Right. So the book explores the arguments for and against eliminating the penny. Some people, they like the tradition, the sentimental value.
The nostalgia.
Exactly. Others point to the economic inefficiency of producing something that costs more to make than it's worth.
Yeah. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense from a purely economic standpoint.
No. So they present a couple of potential solutions.
Okay.
One is eliminating it altogether.
Just get rid of it.
The other is rebasing it so it would be worth 5 cents instead of 1.
Interesting.
So it's a tough issue. Economic considerations,
Sure.
logistical considerations,
Yeah, and a little bit of emotional attachment too.
Exactly. Okay, now let's dive into a concept that affects everyone, whether they realize it or not. Mental accounting.
Mental accounting, what's that?
It's this way that we tend to treat money differently based on its source
Huh.
or its intended use.
Give me an example.
Okay, well, think about it.
Yeah.
Are you more willing to spend money that you won at a casino compared to money you earned by working?
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. It feels different, doesn't it?
It does. Or how about the way we kind of create these separate budgets in our heads for things like groceries or entertainment or vacations?
Right. It's like we have these mental compartments for different categories of spending.
Yeah. And this mental accounting, it's a psychological quirk. And it can actually lead us to make some pretty irrational financial decisions.
Okay. So how do we avoid falling into that trap?
Well, the key is to be aware of it,
Okay.
to recognize those mental biases and make choices that actually align with our overall financial goals.
That makes sense. Being mindful of how we think about money can really help us make better decisions.
Definitely. All right, let's wrap up this segment with an interesting example from the music industry.
Okay. What have they got for us?
The book, it talks about musician Jane Siberry.
Jane Siberry. Okay.
She decided to let fans decide how much they wanted to pay for downloads of her music on her website.
So instead of setting a fixed price, she basically said, pay what you want.
Yeah. It's a pretty bold move, especially in an industry that's been, grappling with piracy and declining album sales.
Yeah, it's definitely a different approach.
And this pay what you want model, it's an interesting experiment. It really empowers consumers to determine the worth of the music, and it challenges those, traditional pricing strategies.
Yeah, I like it. Puts a lot of trust in the fans.
Right. It's about building a different kind of relationship between artists and fans.
Welcome back to the deep dive. It always kind of amazes me how much we take for granted. Like even simple things like the prices we see at the grocery store.
Yeah, like why is an apple so much more expensive than a banana, for instance?
Exactly. Talking about the economics of fruit pricing, right? I'll admit, I usually just grab my apples and bananas and go, without giving it a whole lot of thought.
Right.
But when we look a little closer, it's actually a perfect illustration of those fundamental economic principles, supply and demand. Everything from the way it's produced to how far it has to travel, even just how long it lasts before going bad, it all plays a role.
So how do those things actually play into the cost of my fruit salad?
Well, think about the journey that banana takes to get from, the farm to your grocery basket.
Okay.
It grows in tropical climates, pretty easy to ship and store, so it ends up being a lot cheaper than an apple, which might need more delicate handling, special transportation, things like that.
So a banana's journey is simpler and cheaper, therefore lower price tag at the store.
Got it.
What else influences the cost?
Well, you also have things like seasonality and regional variations. The apple's going to cost more in a region where it's not in season or where they just don't grow as many locally.
So it's kind of like this invisible hand guiding prices based on all these different factors, huh? It makes you realize just how much goes on behind the scenes of something as simple as grabbing a piece of fruit.
Speaking of hidden complexities, let's talk about airline pilot salaries and how that potentially impacts safety. Interesting.
So in the book, the authors share insights from a pilot friend. They call him Captain Steve. And he argues that this constant push for lower airfares has led to a decline in how much pilots get paid, especially those working for regional airlines.
I see. So this race to the bottom, as they call it, for fares, could have some unintended consequences when it comes to safety.
Right. Captain Stees contends that lower pay, it can lead to pilot fatigue, burnout, even compromises in safety, as airlines try to cut corners to keep costs down.
So while we all love a good deal on airfare, it's worth thinking about what might be sacrificed to get that low price right.
Absolutely. The safety of everyone on board relies on those pilots.
Sure.
It all comes back to those trade-offs, What are we willing to prioritize as consumers? Do we want the absolute cheapest price, or are we willing to pay a little more for peace of mind? Something to think about the next time you're booking a flight. Yeah, good point. Okay, let's shift gears a bit to something a little lighter. Remember that Wayne effect we talked about earlier?
Oh, yeah. Where Levitt banned his daughters from dating anyone with the middle name Wayne.
Right. Seemed a little overprotective, maybe?
Maybe a little bit, yeah. But it does make you think about the power of names. Levitt's observation, even though it's kind of a joke, it suggests that names with certain cultural associations can actually affect how we see people, and even how we act.
Yeah, so it's not about the name Wayne itself. It's more about what that name might represent, like maybe some subconscious link to certain stereotypes or cultural references.
Exactly. Our brains are wired to make connections, and names, even those middle names, can act as these little triggers,
It's like how certain first names, like, for example, Florence, might be associated with nursing, thanks to Florence Nightingale.
Right. And even those tiny little associations, they can influence how we interact with someone, even the decisions we make.
It's wild, like all those little subtle influences that shape our perception.
It is. It makes you realize that, things aren't always what they seem. Now, speaking of names, they also get into this whole thing about aptonyms in the book.
Aptonyms?
Yeah. Those names that, perfectly match a person's job or their personality.
Oh, right. They told that story about Pageworthy, the fact checker.
Yes. The name fits so perfectly. It's almost too good to be true.
I know. It's like, what are the chances? But it also highlights the fact that historically there's been this link between names and professions. Back in the day, a lot of last names were based on what people did for a living, like Smith, Baker, or Cooper, things like that.
Right, so those names weren't random choices, They actually told you something about a person's identity and how they made a living.
Yeah. So aptonyms are kind of like these little linguistic time capsules, right?
Yeah.
They're connecting us to a time when names actually meant something more.
That's a great way to put it, even though nowadays we choose names for all sorts of different reasons.
True. Let's shift gears now to something a little less, I guess, positive. The economics of hate mail.
Oh, wow. Okay. Hate mail, that's a tough one.
Yeah. So Dubner, he got this hate-filled message from a pretty strange website. It's called www.whotahate.com.
Seriously? A website called Who to Hate?
Yeah. And get this. For the low price of $5, you can send an anonymous hate message to anyone you choose.
It's kind of disturbing, the people are actually willing to pay to spread hate.
I know. Makes you wonder, what's the motivation? Is it just to get those angry feelings out, or is there something more to it?
Yeah, what is it about hate mail that people find so appealing? Is it the act of expressing that hate that feels good? Or is it more about wanting to hurt the person on the receiving end?
I mean, there's no doubt that the internet makes people bolder, hiding behind that anonymity. And Dubner, he even suggests that, to really up the ante, the website could offer a premium service where for a larger sum of money, they would actually reveal the sender's identity to the recipient.
Wow. That's next level hate mail, taking it to a whole new level.
Right. And it raises all these ethical questions about anonymity online.
Yeah.
How it could be used for really harmful purposes.
It definitely makes you think. Okay. Let's move on to something, I guess, a little more practical. Generic drug pricing.
Okay. Yeah. Generic drugs. It's a topic that affects a lot of people.
Yeah, definitely. So Dubner shares this experience he had. He found these huge price differences for generic Prozac at different pharmacies.
Really?
Yeah. It turned out that warehouse clubs like Costco and Sam's Club, they offered the medication for way less than those traditional drugstore chains.
So same medication, but drastically different prices depending on where you go.
Exactly. Kind of crazy, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Why do you think there's such a big discrepancy?
Well, I think it just shows how important it is to be an informed consumer, especially when it comes to healthcare.
Right.
Doing your research, comparing prices, even checking out those alternative options like those warehouse clubs. It can really save you a lot of money.
Especially on something as essential as medication. It really pays to shop around.
It really does.
Okay, so how about this? Who here loves the car buying process?
Ugh. It's always a headache. So much back and forth.
Yeah. Dubner actually talks about his own experience trying to negotiate a lower car price online.
Oh, okay. Did it work?
Well, he ended up walking away from the deal.
Really? What happened?
The dealer, he just wouldn't budge on the price, kept using all these tactics and strategies.
Oh, classic dealer games.
Yeah. And it's a perfect example of how complex those car buying negotiations can be.
Yeah.
You know, the dealer, they're trying to make as much money as possible.
Right.
And the buyer, they're trying to get the best deal they can.
It's a battle of wills.
It is. And sometimes walking away is the smartest move. You got to know when to hold them, know when to fold them, right?
Exactly. Don't be afraid to walk away. Okay. Let's move on to a topic that's been around forever. The penny.
The penny.
Yeah. Should we keep it or should we just get rid of it? I mean, it costs more to make than it's actually worth.
And honestly, who even uses pennies anymore?
Right. So they talk about the different arguments for and against eliminating it. Some people are attached to the tradition.
The nostalgia.
Exactly. Others say it's just not practical anymore.
Makes sense. So what do they propose we do?
Well, they talk about a couple of options. One is just to get rid of it completely.
Just ditch the penny.
The other is to rebase it. So instead of being worth 1 cent, it would be worth 5.
Interesting. So kind of like a mini nickel.
Yeah, exactly. But, there are all sorts of economic and logistical things to consider.
Not to mention people's emotional attachment to it, right?
For sure. Okay, now let's dive into a concept that affects us all, whether we realize it or not. Mental accounting.
Mental accounting. What's that?
It's the way we tend to, categorize and treat money differently depending on where it came from or what we plan to use it for.
Give me an example.
Okay, so think about this. Are you more likely to spend money you won at a casino than money you earned working?
Oh, yeah, for sure. It feels different somehow.
Right. Or how about how we make these separate budgets in our heads for different things like groceries, entertainment, vacation spending?
Right. It's like we have these different mental accounts.
Exactly. And this mental accounting thing, it can actually lead us to make some pretty irrational financial decisions.
Oh, so?
Well, we might be super careful with our hard-earned paycheck, but then blow a ton of money on, something frivolous if it's found money, like a lottery winning or a tax refund.
It's fascinating how our brains work. We actually treat money differently based on its backstory, even though a dollar's a dollar no matter where it came from.
Exactly. That's why it's so important to be aware of this mental accounting thing. Once you recognize those patterns in your thinking, you can start making smarter financial decisions.
Make those dollars work for you, not against you. Okay, so to wrap things up, let's look at a musician who totally flipped the script on how music is priced.
Okay, who are we talking about?
So they talk about Jane Siberry in the book. She's a musician who decided to let her fans decide how much they wanted to pay for downloads of her music on her website.
Wow. So instead of setting a price, she was like, pay what you want. That's pretty radical.
Yeah. Especially in an industry that's been fighting so hard against piracy and declining album sales.
Yeah, for sure. It's a bold move.
It is. And this pay what you want model, it's a really interesting experiment. It puts the power in the hands of the consumer. They get to decide what the music is worth to them.
It also shows a lot of trust in the fans,
Yeah. And it's about building that connection between the artist and the audience based on transparency and respect. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. One of the things that always strikes me about Levitt and Dubner's work is how they make you question your assumptions about how the world works.
Okay.
Like we think we understand why things are the way they are, but then you look at the data and sometimes it's a whole different story.
Yeah, they have this way of uncovering these hidden patterns, these connections that you wouldn't normally see. It's like they're revealing these aha moments, that kind of make you rethink everything.
Like we were talking about earlier, the price of fruit. Why an apple is more expensive than a banana. They use that example, something we see every day, to illustrate this basic economic principle, supply and demand.
Exactly. The price of anything, whether it's a piece of fruit or a house, is determined by how those two forces interact. The availability of the product, the desire for the product, it all comes down to that. Think about all the things that go into getting that fruit from the farm to your grocery basket, the cost of growing it, picking it, shipping it, even just how long it can sit on a shelf before going bad.
So a banana, which is relatively easy to grow, transport, and store, ends up being cheaper than an apple, which might be a little more delicate, have a shorter shelf life, things like that. It's amazing how much goes into something so simple.
And you can't forget consumer preferences. If suddenly everyone decided they only wanted apples, the price would go way up, regardless of the cost of production. Those two forces, supply and demand, they're always in play, constantly pushing and pulling on prices in just about every market you can think of, from groceries to housing to the stock market.
It's like this giant interconnected web. Okay, let's switch gears for a minute. There's this trend that's been discussed a lot in recent years, the decline in women's happiness.
Yeah, it's a little counterintuitive, isn't it? Women have made so much progress in education, in employment, in their overall social standing. You would think they'd be happier than ever.
Right. So what's going on?
It's a complicated issue, but the authors explore a few possible explanations. One thing they point to is this increased pressure on women to juggle so many roles: work, family, personal life. The expectations have definitely shifted, but the support systems haven't necessarily caught up.
It's like we expect women to do it all, have it all, but without providing the resources or the infrastructure to actually make that possible.
Exactly. And then, you layer on things like the gender pay gap, the lack of affordable childcare, the constant pressure from society about beauty standards and body image. It all takes a toll.
It's a lot to carry. It makes you realize that progress in one area doesn't necessarily equal happiness and well-being overall. We have to look at those systemic issues that are holding women back.
Absolutely. Okay, let's move on to a topic that's always intrigued me: the economics of charitable giving.
Yeah, why do people give to certain causes and not others? Is it purely out of the goodness of their hearts, or are there other things motivating them?
It's an interesting question, right? Like, what makes people open their wallets or donate their time? The author suggests that our motivations for giving, they're often influenced by more than just simple altruism.
Okay, so you're saying it's not always about being completely selfless.
Right. There might be a personal connection, or it might align with our values or beliefs, or maybe it's something that directly impacts our community. Those things tend to resonate more with people.
So it's about feeling a connection to the cause.
Yeah, and we can also be swayed by emotional appeals, or the perception that a certain charity is really effective, or even just social pressure. That desire to fit in, to be seen as generous, that can play a role too.
So even something as seemingly pure as charity can be influenced by all these different factors.
Yeah.
It's more complex than we might initially think.
Exactly. Okay, so as we wrap up our deep dive into when to rob a bank, I want to leave you with one final thought-provoking idea from the book.
All right, what is it?
They really emphasize the importance of always questioning our assumptions and being open to new perspectives.
It's like that saying, the more you know, the more you realize you don't know.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Don't just accept things at face value. Be skeptical. Look at the evidence. Think critically, even when it leads you to conclusions that are uncomfortable or unexpected.
Be curious. Ask questions. Don't settle for the easy answers. The world is a fascinating place, and there's always more to learn. Well, that's it for our deep dive into when to rob a bank. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And keep those brain cells firing, everyone.